that's just in case you're wondering, it's the ruins of a space station. I have a little bit less time than I actually planned, but that's okay. If you've seen my talks before, you know I'm capable of speaking quickly. We're going to be talking about modeling a universe in Perl. When I say modeling a universe, just to make it clear, we do have a section in our config called physics, which has the speed of light, the gravitational constant, and stuff like that, because there's actually real science we layer underneath this, which doesn't pop up too much. But in this case, modeling a universe, I'm talking about how the various things in the game are going to be interacting with one another. And actually, as it turns out, standard object-oriented modeling techniques that we take for granted for a business environment where everything has a discrete use case doesn't work as well for creating an MMORPG. And by the way, I just want to say, so welcome to the Perl Conference, or as I like to call it, the conference formerly known as YAPSI. So, thank you. I showed this slide in Europe at one point and got a bunch of blank stares. No one had a clue. Yes. Thank you. That was awful. Sorry. So, I represent all around the world. My name is Curtis Poe, better known as Ovid to many people in the Perl community. I'm with the Perl Foundation, who does not officially endorse this talk. I'm the CTO, and in case you're wondering, we do a lot of consulting, training, most of this, but not all of us, specializing in Perl. If your company has trouble finding Perl developers and is interested in hiring a remote, we are really, really good at putting together remote teams of top-tier developers and also managing them effectively for you to get stuff done. So I'm at the conference to meet people, to talk to people, and by the time I'm done with this talk, if I have the time, you'll see why we do some of the things so well and what our teams are capable of putting together. So talk to me afterwards. Ask me about what we can do, ask for my card, whatever, enough of that. Question policy is very simple. If I explain something you didn't understand, it means someone else didn't understand. I have failed as a speaker. Hold up your hand, interrupt me. Otherwise, please hold questions till the end of the talk, especially this time, to make sure that we do not run out of time. So, modeling a universe, what is a universe? In this particular case, we're creating a text-based sci-fi MMORPG, and it runs on browser, mobile. Because it mostly has a web interface, it is extremely platform independent, which is great. You can, MMORPG, you can play on anything you want to. It's also accessible, which is something we feel is very important. We've been working very hard to make sure if you're blind, you can still play it. If you have to navigate the web with a sip and puff device, there are some people, they simply have a stick in their mouth and they have to tap that way. And we want to make sure as much as possible, it's harder to do this, but we still want to make sure that they can have access to this and enjoy the world also. Because on the web, nobody knows that you're blind or whatever. And it's also a free-to-play game. For those of you, in case you're familiar with the industry and you're wondering what we mean by free-to-play, we also mean the fair play model, where there's no level caps, there's no pay to win. Hey, someone knows about this. So the story, very short version of this, roughly 600 years in the future, humanity had hit post-scarcity society with an attendant post-scarcity decline, but had also managed to start interstellar colonization of the galaxy and was doing fantastic and was spreading out, having some difficulties, and then the catastrophe struck. All across the galaxy, planetary defense systems turned on planets, ships, reactors went critical, airlocks were being vented, were being purged. In the space of a few hours, most of humanity was on the verge of extinction, and then it stopped. And no one knows why. It turns out this is extremely relevant to the game, but you won't find out immediately. Humanity's been reduced to a sphere about 40 light years across, centered on Sol. And they're in the process of rebuilding civilization. So if you want to, you can think of it kind of a cross between Mad Max and Firefly, or heavy doses of The Expanse in there also, if you're familiar with that. And there's a lot of stuff in there. Because we are talking about an MMORPG, this is extremely complicated, much more than people would think. There's 117 stars within 20 light years of Earth. Probably 117 stars. It turns out that's a hard question to actually answer effectively. There's over 500 space stations, over 9,000 areas to explore. There's lots and lots of stuff. But the alpha is going to be a little bit more limited because we just want to make sure we get the first version of the gameplay out there so people can see what's going on. But even though it's text-based, our graphics are still pretty cool. This is a security station. There's your character page. I actually had to shrink that down because there's a lot of information that we track about everything. Give you all sorts of interesting options. You can go to the Career Center, you can get a job, long-term career if you want to, which happens to suit your particular playing style. There's side jobs available. There's also missions you can take. Now, anyone here played Warcraft? So, what's a mission like in Warcraft? Hello, young brave adventurer. You have many difficult trials to get here. Please go out and pick 10 flowers for me. And then you get this economically improbable reward. They're very linear, I like Warcraft, but the mission system's a little bit dull. Ours is very non-linear. We're working very hard with our narrative team to make sure that each mission kind of reads like a mini short story. It's very interesting, very story-driven, very complex, very hard to do, but we're having a lot of fun with it. Of course, you're gonna get money for your missions, and if you don't want to get mugged, have the money stolen, you can put the money in a bank. But if they do mug you, you might wind up in a sick bay, or worse, you might have to regenerate at a clone vat so that you don't die. Afterwards, you might want to relax in the bar. And you really can't see it, but there's one thing I really appreciate about this that our artist has done. In the very background of the bar, it's very hard to see. You might see this gentle sloping blue curve. That's a viewport out onto a planet, and you can actually see he's put the atmospheric haze in there. There's tremendous amounts of detail that most folks won't notice, but I really appreciate the fact that we pay attention to it. But traveling to the stars, that's a big deal with science fiction games. That's stuff a lot of folks want to do. So you go down to the port, you hop on a spaceship, many different types of spaceships. I love the work our artist does. And there's also the star map. So this is a map of all the stars within 20 light years of Earth. So I wrote this in JavaScript and handed it over to our front-end team, and they laughed and promptly rewrote it. So you can't see it up there. I made the colors of the stars astronomically correct. I always do that every frickin' time. I made the colors of the stars astronomically correct. Again, it's one of those little details that we pay attention to, just this little subtle background thing. And some of you might be wondering at this point, how does that jive with being accessible? How's a blind player going to be able to use that star map? Well, their screen reader is actually going to see something which looks like this. So it's harder to use, but it's available. So we work hard on this. This is a work in progress. This is what's called a game flow diagram. This is how you train in a gym to build up your stats. But enough of that. You probably want to know, what's the Perl look like? What does the code look like? What are we doing there? So the game is closed source because we can't reveal the game's secrets, but we're trying to push back as much to the open source community as we can. A long time ago, I released read-only begin lift because of that and promptly stopped using it. I was using test class, and then I said, this sucks, so I wrote test class most, and I took a lot of the knowledge from that and eventually rolled that into test class moose, which Dave has taken over. Thank you very much for taking over the maintenance. Anyone here use test class moose, by the way? Oh, yeah, well, anyone here who's not ZipRecruiter, out of curiosity? Okay, so test class moose, a lot of fantastic stuff available with that. You really should pay attention to that. DBX class reports is another module. Test class moose history, Dave's starting to possibly roll that into core, but we need more feedback on that. It's really awesome, and you'll see why in a bit. Open source patches, Catalyst Simplex login, some date time stuff. There's more. Also, there's an email testing module we're going to be releasing soon. So we're trying to give back as much as we can, and we encourage our developers, if it's not business related, let people have it. And our principles for building the game, first of all, this is the principles we use for our people in general. We only use proven technologies. So we try to avoid hype-driven development, anything which, ooh, that's really cool and exciting. The most exciting technology we have in there is some Golang and some bots for stuff that if we take that away, it doesn't impact anything. If it fails, it's not a problem. So we're very conservative about what we use. We also extremely, extremely careful hiring. Very few companies know how to hire. We have a very good system of hiring, which is actually based upon proven techniques for getting much, much better employees with developer tests, structured interviews, and getting them on board so that really fantastic people there. It's really helped us quite a bit. And very, very strong testing. If you know me, well, of course, that's it. You can go out and Google the Zen of Test Suites by Ovid, which explains my personal testing philosophy, which has really made this a lot easier. That's kind of what some of that is, but I won't go into that now. Instead, our testing itself is mostly based around test class Moose. We use Protractor for some of our front-end stuff. We were using Selenium, and that turned out to be a big bucket of suck. So we are not using Selenium anymore. Protractor, in theory, it's for AngularJS, but in reality, it's any front-end stuff you want. Load testing, again, that's Golang bots I wrote. The over 15,000 tests in our test suite right now. And test history, oh my God, that's fantastic. But I'll get to that in a moment. The test suite itself takes about 15 minutes to run in its entirety. Last time I gave this talk, it was about 6 or 7 minutes for 11,000 tests, but we've put in some pretty heavy tests in there. When I 15 minutes to run 15,000 tests, by comparison, when I first started with the BBC on their core metadata repository, we had about 11,000 tests, and that was about 5 times longer to run. If you were to take our test class moves test suite and break that out into separate T files, I've got a little sample program which will do this. It will take, we go from 9 minutes and 33 seconds for those tests up to 80 minutes. So that's one of the many benefits of using a framework like test class moves for your test suite. Tremendously improves speed. And as you know, if you improve the speed, you improve the chance that your developers are actually going to run the tests. And so you can see how we're actually doing. This is our real test coverage. It's not perfect, but for this size of an application, it's not too bad. And we do monitor Jenkins run to always get this available. But oh, this is what I love, test failures. So I've truncated the class names to make it a little bit easier to fit on the slide. You can actually see on that right-hand column, that's a lot of test failures. That's really embarrassing. You don't want to have an app that fragile, but oh, wait, that's like also testing our development branches. If I just check master, by passing the master switch into my little test failure script, you can see the number of tests have dropped dramatically, but you can also see the first time that particular test failed, the last time that particular test failed. So the last time they failed, that was actually kind of old. So if I just restrict this to the last couple of weeks, I'm only down to 4 test failures in master, and it turns out that particular test failure was an intermittent failure that was independent. So we mock time, that failure went away. So boom, no more failures in our test suite. And that also works on our Jenkins server too. So we can pull down all the test failures from our Jenkins server, and we can see things like our leaderboards were failing more often than we realized because we have this history. So the leaderboards probably are not going to be part of alpha, and it turns out there's some other structural problems with them we hadn't known about. That's what test history does for you. It is so much easier to find out what's going on. I can also, now for test class moves, I can pass a failed switch, and it will automatically run the last set of tests which failed. Much easier to development in. So this is only on GitHub right now because it's a proof of concept. And I passed it out there for folks so you can pay attention to this and see what this can do for you. If you're using test class moves, it's dirt simple to use. It doesn't have to be Git for the branch and the commit. You can use SVN, Mercurial, whatever, I don't care. Those just have to be identifiers so that later on it can produce good information for you. There's more information out there. It's fairly decently documented on GitHub, but it is not ready for prime time yet. So please, if you're interested in it, use it. It works well. Give feedback, especially for Dave, because he's the poor soul who's working with this right now. We really like to have this out there so everyone using really heavyweight test suites can take advantage of this. And as you can see, almost all tools are open source, with the exception of JavaScript, which is actually just an open standard. And like I said, we're conservative. We're just using standard MVC model internally for doing this. Catalyst template toolkit, DBX class, nothing fancy about that. So this is what one of our controllers look like. This is how, if you visit a clone vat, you might want to purchase a new clone. Because this is a far future, society's collapsed, they have a lot of restricted universes, a lot of restricted resources. You buy a new clone, they actually take your old clone out and kill it. So it's kind of creepy at points, but it's supposed to be. But you'll notice we have C character purchase clone. That's the controller. That's it. The controller is just there to connect the view and the model. Do not put logic in your controllers. It makes it harder to test. It makes it harder to reuse. The controller should just be connecting these two sides. Then afterwards, we just redirect back to the index page, and that's it. But what does that look like? What does it look like in the actual model, you might be wondering. So this is a slightly older version of this. This was a method called gestate, and this was inside of our clone model. how the clone would be able to gestate the new character. And the developer who wrote this should probably be fired, but that's me. So I'll explain to you why this is so bad. So first of all, the font is too small here. Or I'm too old, one of the two. First thing we do is we throw an exception if they're not in the clone vat. We generally don't throw exceptions too much unless we happen to get to a point where they shouldn't have been, they've been fiddling around with the URL. In which case, if they get a 500 error, that's not my problem. But, so the gestate method throws an exception if they're not in the clone vat. Then we rummage around in the character's wallet, see if they have enough money. We start a transaction, we take the money out of their wallet, we go ahead and gestate the new clone and finish up the transaction. Yeah, there's finishing the then we add the messages. These are the sort of messages that we build up along the way to let the person know everything that happened in that particular action. And then this shows up on the main page. You can see that at the top. You purchase a new clone, how much money it cost, you know, some little descriptive text of what the clone looks like swelling in its little clone pod. That sucks. So for those of you who are really familiar with OO modeling, you might be wondering, why is the clone class rummaging around in the character's wallet? No, it should not be doing that. Why is the clone class checking to see where the character is? What if I want to buy a ship and I put a cloning pod on my ship, if I'm able to do that in the future? I can't use this because it's trying to assert that they're actually in the clone vat, which is an area on a space station. So we have some very inflexible, unreusable code. So here's what it looks like now. This is what's called an economic exchange. I won't go into the background of what that means, but basically, this is mostly declarative code. For those of you who are more declarative code and logic programming, you know you can order those things any way you want to, but we also have some time sequences sometimes in these, so the order of these tends to be dependent. And what you have is you set up some metadata about it, and then you call steps. And these are the individual steps you have to verify, like the location, self, is in area, clone vat, wallet, self, pay, price. Then clone, self, gestate in that area. Those steps are easy to change. They're easy to share with others. They're easy to customize in case you need to change stuff. It is much, much easier to write that. And those are effectively, you can think of those as semantic triples. We list the context for it, and then there's the triple, and it's subject, verb, object, order. That's one of the very important things we focused on tremendously inside of this code base. Make sure things are in subject, verb, object order so you can always understand them. So which of those do you want to make? Yeah, on the right? Oh my goodness, that's so much easier. So a clone vat is in case you die and you need to be resurrected. And what does it look like if you die? Well, there's the steps for it. First of all, we take everything out of your inventory, we move you to the clone vat area, we do all these steps, which if you can read that, you can know what the logic is, even if you don't know Perl. Sometimes our narrative designers come to me and they say, how do we do this thing? How is it actually happening under the hood? I can cut and paste the steps to the narrative designers who've never touched a programming language in their life, and they can read this. This is so much easier to use. But gestate is now on the character class. Well, that's kind of interesting because anyone heard of the concept of God? That's a problem when it's something a lot of newer developers have. They pack a lot of behavior into objects. They pack so much behavior into objects which the objects have nothing to do. I know of a guy who, in order to break this habit with C# developers, he would actually name the classes after creatures. Like, here's the authentication fairy, and here was the session gnome. And after a while, somehow people learned that the session gnome only knows about sessions. The fairy only knows about authentication. The troll knows about authorization. And it stopped the problem where you had these idiots writing the start HTML class. Yes, they had one. So single responsibility principle means you want to only have one reason to change a class, but in an MMORPG, the character is driving everything. And I was trying to avoid this. I was really trying to avoid this because look at this. Look at all the different things a character can do in an MMORPG because that is the central thing about it. This is not a discrete business process where I have a simple invoice object and I have an order object I can attach to the invoice object, and I have item objects I can attach to the order object, which I can attach to the invoice object, and I can attach a customer. this doesn't work that way. Traditional OO modeling is very hard to do with this. So, what we had was a clone with a gestate method originally, but as you saw, the clone class was rummaging around in the character's wallet, checking to see who the character was. That logic really didn't belong there. And so that's what led us to this. Because who's responsible? As I said, characters drive all actions, almost all actions in MMORPGs. It's not entirely true. But originally I had code like this in a verb, subject, object order because I was trying to avoid God objects. And I put the has missions for into the missions class. Missions has missions for Alice, Bob, and I could never read that code. I wrote the code and I could never understand what it said. And then I eventually bit the bullet and I put the has missions for method into the character class if Alice has missions for Bob, and now I know exactly what it means. There's zero ambiguity. So how do I avoid God objects? If you are familiar with partial classes, this is something you often find as part of compilers and stuff. A compiler, maybe you'll add in your editor, part of something you might find with an editor. Well, you add some annotations to your code. So for this particular attribute, we want it to be public, they should be able to set it. So it might, behind the scenes, build up a bunch of code, getters and setters, compile this into a separate partial class, or build this into a separate partial class, and then when you hit compile, it folds all of this into one big class behind the scenes, and then everything just magically works. That sounds an awful lot like roles. So what I did, I thought about this, and I started thinking about partial classes. Generally, they're something dealing with IDEs and compilers. We don't see them. I've just made them very front and center in this. And it's no longer a code generation thing. So we have a partial class like this. This is kind of a shorthand for what our character clone partial class looks like. Instead of single responsibility for a class, we have single responsibility for a partial class. And then we have tests for that. And then in the character class, I'm lying about some of this. I'm keeping it simple. In the character class, what we do is we simply apply that list of roles to the character. And now the character can do all of this stuff. Every partial class now has a single responsibility. It turns out this is really easy to maintain. It is really easy to understand, and it's going to go wrong. We've been waiting for a couple of years for this to go wrong, and it's working. It violates so much of what we think about for good OO design, and it works beautifully. So, that's the character. You've got a combat suit, because there's going to be combat in our MMORPG. So you're wearing your combat suit, and it serves as an armor item. And then someone attacks you, and the suit shoots back. Well, now it serves as a weapon item. And then you got hit, so it patches you up real quick. So it serves as a medical item. And then it turns out, like me, you're a coward, so it gives you a little pep talk. And then as a psychiatrist, single responsibility, my ass. Pardon my language, but how do you do modeling like that? Oh, that's a medical item. I have no idea why that slide happens to be there, but some of the stuff our artist does. So in gaming, there's a pattern known as entity component system. And this is very fascinating. When you start reading about this and you start understanding how this is put together, entities are what we tend to think of as objects. You have a gun, you have a suit of armor, you have a med kit, you have whatever. A component is an aspect of its behavior. Don't think aspect-oriented programming, for God's sake, save yourself. It's just an aspect of behavior that entity might have, and then the system handles more or less how these things work. So, in fact, an object, an item is simply data. There is no behavior attached to these objects. Instead, so this is how it works in a traditional game, like a game with graphics that you might see. You have what we call a game loop, where we get the user input, and while the game is running, get the user input, we update the state, and then we draw the next slide, whatever. And what does update state look like? So it might, in this case, it might be you have the animals hide from danger and forage for food, they move about, and then maybe they attack other animals. What does forage for food look like? Down here in this method, for entity and entities, if is animal entity, search for food entity. Notice the behavior is not on the object. These are functions that you pass this intelligent data structure to, and it knows how to inspect and take the right action because the class is not. The class is irrelevant in this particular case. For the web, however, we don't have a game loop. That simply doesn't exist. It depends upon whether or not you click on the next thing. So we check our behavior as needed, and this is really simplified things. So let me give you an older version, which isn't what we do now, but it's easier to explain. Let's assume we only have 3 types of entities, which are armor, weapons, and mod. A mod could be a bionic or a genetic modification that you get installed in a sick bay. And we have global attributes. Everything has a name, everything has a weight, or mass actually, all sorts of things about that. It might serve as armor, it might serve as a mod, it might serve as a weapon. We join that from the item table, and then we do left outer joins against the components, so that down at the bottom, you see those predicate methods which are available. We just check to see if the ID is defined. Does it serve as armor? Does it serve as weapon? Does it serve as a mod? And let's see how this works with the economic as I showed you earlier. So here's how you install a mod. First, you check to see if the person's not confined. You make sure that they're in the sick bay. You make sure they have the money to pay for the mod. And then you actually, I can't see, 5 minutes left? Oh, what's that? Okay. So then we check to see if they actually can install the mod. And inside the inventory, that actually generates an instance of a Vir economic asset inventory class. And install is simply a method on there. And it looks like this. And in that if-else-if chain, we check the item is mod, which is part of that left outer join and the predicate method. Because the items are immutable, that SQL looked pretty expensive, but now trivial to cache. So the SQL, there's a hit on grabbing that data, but then we can cache it. We use a lot of caching because we have a lot of immutable data. So new developer comments about our system, everyone's saying, wow, everything's just so pretty. Another guy, I love this, the guy we hired from Chile, he's like, I'm hired to clean, can't find anything to clean. It's not true, we have a lot to clean, but it's really pretty slick. I'm pretty happy with what we have. Some people think we're smoking crack because it looks a little weird, some of this stuff the first time. If you want to know more about it, you can go to station.space, and you can also sign up for the blog. And that can give you access to possibly A/B testing, or not A/B testing, some of the alpha testing. You might get selected as part of that. Or twitter.com/towstation. That feed is really interesting because it's information about the game, the affiliations in the game, a lot of information about that. But also, we regularly post science articles, particularly about upcoming science. We post information about science fiction authors. So if you're a geek like me who appreciates science fiction, the authors, and science, that feed's full of it, not just our game. That feed's full of it. Maybe I didn't phrase that right. By the way, if you do want this quality for your company, go ahead and drop me a line, info@allaroundtheworld.fr. That actually goes to our director also. Or stop me afterwards, just ask me questions. And because we were running a little low on time, this is a normal thing at this point you've seen before. We can have questions, or we can have bonus slides. Fine, either way. Every single time. Has anybody read The Expanse or seen the TV series? Yeah, awesome. Every once in a while, people ask, why do they have ice mining? The initial ship in the game, in the series, the Canterbury, is an ice hauler from Saturn. And why do you have ice mining? That's stupid. And then I have to explain this is why you have ice mining. The average person in the developed nation uses a cubic water every 2 to 3 days, a cubic meter of water every 2 to 3 days. And invariably, people say, I don't drink that much. Well, Perl developers do, but we're talking about water. In reality, so you're drinking, you're cooking, you're flushing, you're bathing, you're doing all of these things which consumes a lot of water. A cubic meter of water, by the way, weighs a ton, 1,000 kilograms. So we're going to keep the math simple and say you're using 100 cubic meters of water per person per year, 100,000 kilograms per person per year, 10 people, 1 million. That's 1 million kilograms of water per year. So imagine a space station with a population of 100,000, 10 billion kilograms of water a year is necessary. Assuming that we had 99% recycling efficiency on the space station, and even 600 years in the future, that is not going to happen, we're still talking about 10 million kilograms of water. That's about 70 blue whales. That's a huge amount of water. You will lose water. By comparison, the International Space is running about 70% efficiency. They tried to get up to 85%. Turns out some of their water was a little bit too acidic to recycle. So there's going to be huge amounts of ice mining. This will not be an alpha, unfortunately. I did tell our narrative designers, if we don't get a mission called Ice, Ice Baby, someone's getting fired. So, distance between stations, that doesn't matter unless you see this. Orbital velocity, I really like this. I got this thing memorized. This is a calculation for determining how fast a thing orbits around another thing. And the cool thing is the mass of the thing doing the orbiting isn't taken into account. It's not necessary. It's the square root of the gravitational constant times the mass of the central object divided by the radius at which you are orbiting, which means Tau Station, the first space station in the game that you start in, that is the mass of Mars, because that's the planet that you're orbiting. The distance at the bottom we correct for meters in order to keep the units the same. So we actually know how fast our space stations are orbiting. We know how far away from the thing that they're orbiting. This is comparison of Tau Station against the International Space Station, in case you're curious. And what that lets us do is this. So without going into detail, I can pass in a date time for any time and know exactly where a space station is going to be. I used to have a cron job that I wrote which updated this. I'm like, oh, that's stupid. I switched to this, now space stations are immutable, boom, I can cache them. So what stations orbit a given star? This isn't true. They actually orbit a planetary body around the star, but I won't go into details right now. You can fetch the cache stations for the star. This is something similar to what I call an entity set, very similar to a results set. And our caching layer looks like this. I really open source this, but we do have some internal assumptions that we make. And it's only for immutable data. We have a lot of immutable data. And it looks very similar. You can see right here, here's how we start filtering data and sorting data inside of that. It looks very result set. I deliberately made the method names different so that if you're working with them, you will know which you have without having to check the class, except when you're dealing with iterating, so that when it gets passed to the template layer, the designers don't have to care. So, any questions now?
Stars moving?
No. So the stars are all cached. So yes, the stars do move, but the amount of movement over the time is so negligible, it won't matter. Any other questions? But I have a question. How much time do I... Yes. Okay.
This class moves history. It needs work. How much work? When is it going to be prime time?
How much work depends upon what people ask for, what limitations they find. I tried to make the interface very clear. The internals are a little bit icky at times, because I was just hacking this together because I realized I needed to know the history of my test suite so I could track what's going on over time. So you could actually, if you want to, you could toss a graphing front end on that and see which tests are failing over time, how they're performing. There's a lot of data that it catches in there, but it's not nearly enough for what we want. So, and because I designed it for my needs, that's why I didn't put it on the CPAN yet, because I want other people to hack on it and eventually find out what they want. Dave's already had some good ideas about, yes, he's sitting right behind you on that side. He's already got some ideas, about some stuff for that. So try it out, let us know what you think. If you have an existing test class test suite, it's transparent to use. It saves the data in an SQLite database, and if you need to, just type SQLite 3 database name and see what's actually in there. Randall.
This is free now. What's your ultimate financial model?
This is a standard free-to-play financial model where we're using a dual currency system where you have credits for the primary currency and you have bonds as what's called the premium currency. You can effectively farm bonds in-game, or if you want to advance faster, you can purchase them. And it turns out free-to-play games, when done well, earn a lot more money than subscription games because there's nothing to stop someone from paying €1,000 the first day. Yes? I'm not sure I understand your question. Could you rephrase that, please? Interesting challenges in transferring the ownership of something to someone else? Okay, well, so we don't handle rental at this time. And I might add ships even though they're available in the alpha, they're so bloody expensive, you're not going to be able to afford that anyway. But yeah, I can't say that we've had any issues there at all. We have a specialized inventory system where items get attached to inventories, and inventories can be attached to anything which can logically have an inventory. And it's a matter of how we set up that particular economic exchange and what conditions under which that exchange is allowed to occur and whether things get accepted or rejected. So no, we haven't had anything along those lines yet. Any other questions? I'm building a universe and no one's curious? Yes, I know.
When is the alpha launch?
We are hoping to have the alpha launch by the end of summer. Don't know how much I could say, so I'm not going to mention his name. We'll call him Bob. It's one of the top industry experts, actually, is working with us on this. I'm very pleased about that, actually, because he doesn't work with something unless he sees that it has the fundamentals necessary to actually be a success. And as soon as he came in, he was surprised to find out that we had those fundamentals in place. But now it's a matter of fine-tuning them and, getting that launch ready for the alpha. Yes?
You mentioned your team a little bit. There's something in terms of workforce.
We have about 15 people working on it right now. So it turns out that modeling a universe is complex. And to a certain extent, some of our complexity is approaching the complexity of top-tier MMORPGs. But because we don't have the graphics layer, it tremendously simplifies a lot of the problems and reduces our costs by about an order of magnitude. But it still takes a fair development time because of what we're doing. And simplifying stuff by using alternatives to the traditional object model has really helped with this quite a bit. But we're still getting there. Yes?
Like the data store is mostly relational databases?
Almost exclusively PostgreSQL. Because PostgreSQL gives us so many advantages. We do use Redis for our caching layer, and that's primarily caching is almost entirely immutable stuff or stuff that it's okay to have dropped because it might degrade the game experience but not hurt it. So almost exclusively PostgreSQL.
That's a proven technology.
Yes, very technology. So that's part of the reason why we go there.
So there might have been implications to use the graph database or something like that?
No. None, zero. There's actually some really cool stuff in the PostgreSQL field that I've been very interested in, but if it looks like it's experimental, possibly unstable, we don't go there. It sounds fine, it sounds fun, but we are very conservative in our approach to the technology, and it's paid off handsomely because we don't get caught by surprise when, oh, the project's forked, congratulations. Anything else? There's some Kubernetes stuff being done. You'd have to talk to our DevOps side. The project primarily in Vagrant with Debian. I'm running it on OS 10. There was a problem with Windows, which may or may not still be there, but we don't care. So it's very generic. It's a Perl 5.24. We're going to switch to 5.26 as soon as we can because we make very, very heavy use of signatures. Tremendously saved our butt quite a bit, and you may have noticed that on the slides. So it's fairly standard Linux stack, nothing unusual about it. And I think this will be the last question. So load testing, some Perl bots for that, and I should have used like any event or something like that, but I used Parallel Fork Manager, and after hitting some load testing issues, eventually I discovered I could crash my faster than the server. So I thought about switching to something event-driven, and then I realized, actually, this is what Golang is practically a perfect use case for it. So I rewrote our bots in Golang, and we're at the point now where we've got 200 Golang bots can easily hit our server, and it slows down a little bit, but it's not bad. And when you consider that they're generally running an order of magnitude, 1 or 2 orders of magnitude faster than humans are, it's a good sign. And we're continuing to do work on that. Setting up slow query logs, finding out, what's actually causing the congestion at certain points. reducing memory consumption in a few areas. But yeah, that's an ongoing part of the process right now. No, you can come and talk to me afterwards. I deliberately didn't post the slides for a variety of reasons. And I'm sorry about that, but I'm happy to have this filmed because the slides themselves don't work as well out of context, without this talk. So if people watch the video, they can see the context along with the slides, and that'll make it a lot easier for them to follow what's going on. Thank you very much. And again, feel free to stop me afterwards, ask me anything, ask about our services, ask about